I've had no peace of mind since we lost America. Forests old as the world itself. Meadows, plains, strange, delicate flowers, immense solitudes, and all nature new to art. All ours. Mine. Gone. A paradise. Lost.
Hello, history friends, and welcome back to Historical USA. Here we discuss the people, places, and events that have made up the fabric of America. And we are starting off with episode 1 of season 2 of the podcast. And I'm so excited. We are done with the French and Indian War, and we are going to get into the cause. The reasons for the colonists declaring independence in 1776 and seeking to establish their own nation. Now, before we get into the episode, if you are not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and make sure you have that bell checked so that you get notified every time I upload a new video. Also, we have launched the Historical USA Book Club. Now, the book club is over on my Patreon. It is completely free if you choose to sign up as a free member. That doesn't mean that you will not have access to the book club. If you want to be a paid member over there, there are 2 tiers. You can help support me in my work here on YouTube. You get early access to the videos and a video shout out if that is something you want to do. However, if you just want to join the book club, go to Patreon. It is free to join. It's a very low maintenance book club. If you are interested in finding some new books to read on American history, we'd love to have you over there. Now, let's get into the episode. Many historians will tell you that the beginning of the American Revolution kind of starts with the French and Indian War. And if you've watched some of the other episodes on the French and Indian War, we start to see cracks in the system. We start to see prejudices forming between those in England and those in the colonies. But one of the real big catalysts to the American Revolution will be the coronation of King George III. In this video, we are going to explore why King George III was different from his predecessors, and what did he do that actually made the colonists look at him as the villain, especially when one could argue that it was Parliament making these decisions, issuing these authoritarian and tyrannical edicts, not necessarily the king. With the surrender of Montreal on September 8th, 1760, the French and Indian War was now over. King George II reveled in the success of William Pitt the Elder's successful war plan and the French's surrender in North America. However, George II wouldn't be celebrating long, as tragically he would pass several weeks later. The king would die of a heart attack at the age of 77 years old. His 22-year-old grandson, George III, would then ascend to the throne while the 7 Years' War raged. In George's first address to Parliament as new king, he declared that he was different than his forefathers and that he was born and educated in this country. I glory in the name of Britain, he declared. Now, to understand the significance of this statement, we must look to his predecessors. Now, I know that we Americans, we don't like to spend time kind of looking through the monarchy. We're not interested in it. But to really understand the effect of King George III, we need to understand who the Hanoverian kings were. Now, in 1714, Queen Anne would die without an heir, and the closest senior Protestant relative to Queen Anne was her second cousin, George I of Hanover. George I was the great-grandson of James VI. During his ascent, he would successfully put down a Jacobite rebellion, hoping to install the Catholic half-brother of Queen Anne, James Francis Edward Stuart. Now, when George I becomes king, the monarch's authority would decline, and Britain would transition to the current cabinet government system headed by a prime minister that we see today. But why would the king relinquish so much power to Parliament? Well, several reasons. For one, George I spoke German and French, and he spoke very little English. He was born in Hanover, Germany, and he was German. And he also preferred to spend most of his time in Hanover, as he was also serving as an elector to the Holy Roman Empire. Another reason was he was unfamiliar with the customs and practices of the English, and really very rarely attended government cabinet meetings. Because of this, George I would enable the cabinet to act together to establish policies that, if supported by a majority in the Commons, the king was usually powerless to oppose. As George I's reign would conclude, Robert Walpole, who is acknowledged as Britain's kind of first de facto prime minister, was really the one that held any actual political authority. Now, one thing to understand about Robert Walpole is that he was a Whig, and that England would be controlled since the Glorious Revolution by a political philosophy known as Whiggism. Now, the Whigs would begin as a political faction that opposed absolute monarchy, especially a Catholic monarchy. The Whigs supported constitutional and parliamentary government and Protestant supremacy. And this is a political philosophy that would be adopted by the American colonists. One of the greatest achievements of Whiggism is the English Bill of Rights of 1689, which effectively made Parliament, not the Crown, supreme. It would establish free elections to the Commons, free speech in parliamentary debates, and claimed to give all kings of England subjects freedom from cruel or unusual punishment. Some of the Whiggism philosophical origins trace back to John Locke and his two treatises of government, which we have talked about in a previous episode, which I will link up here and in the description if you are interested. And it's important to understand that this philosophy of Whiggism will eventually become republicanism in the United States. And there will be a Whig party later on after independence, but we could talk about that in another episode. While visiting Hanover, George would suffer a stroke and pass away. He's not even buried in England. He would be buried in Hanover. The crown would then pass to George I's eldest son, George II. Now, one thing about the Hanoverian kings is that they hated each other. They hated their wives, they hated their children, they hated each other. And George I completely and absolutely despised his eldest son, George II. George II, though, was a lot like his father. Like his father, he had been born in Hanover, Germany, and spoke mainly French and German. Though unlike his father, George II actually became fluent in English. Also, like his father, George II saw himself as Hanoverian first, not English. He spent a significant amount of time in Hanover. He was deeply connected to Germany, spending much of his time studying German history and culture. He was crowned king October of 1721, and like his father, left Robert Walpole and his dominating Whig party in political power in Parliament, and was happy to do so, as long as Walpole continued to secure the king with a generous civil list, which really is like an allowance for the king. Now, Walpole continued to direct domestic and foreign policy during George II's reign, and George II, like his father, also closely followed the advice of Walpole and his ministers, who were tasked with making all of the major decisions in the country. Really, the only difference in his reign, unlike his father's, was that George II would lead his men in battle against the French during the War of Austrian Succession, and he would be the last monarch to do so. George II would also successfully put down a Jacobite rebellion. And I'm sure you are thinking, Lisa, what does this have to do with the United States if the Hanoverian kings were so hands-off? Well, because the Hanoverian kings were hands-off from the day-to-day matters of government, they were also hands-off from whatever the colonists decided in their own colonies. Parliament allowed for the colonists to set up their own charters, set up their own governments. Really, the only thing that was governmentally appointed would be the royal governors. And for the most part, the royal governors took a lesson from the Hanoverian kings. Let the colonists run their own governments, because if not, as you have seen in other videos, the colonists would take matters into their own hands. Well, all of that starts to change, not necessarily with George III, but with his father, Fredrick. And sadly, just like his father, George II hated his oldest son, Fredrick. Fredrick was also born in Hanover, 1707. When his grandfather, George I, was crowned king, his parents, George II and Caroline of Ansbach, left Hanover for London, and they placed the 7-year-old Fredrick in the care of his granduncle, Ernest Augustus. And he would not see his parents again for 14 years, even though George II made frequent trips back to Germany. Fredrick would set foot in England for the first time a year after his father was crowned king. He would also be known as Prince Frederick Ludwig of Hanover, even after his father created and gave him the title Prince of Wales. Now, the difference between Fredrick and George II is that, unlike George II, who mainly left the governing to his father, Fredrick got right into London politics. He was also prone to drinking and gambling, running up a large amount of debt, womanizing. He had several mistresses, just like his father before him. The Hanoverians were, I am not a historian of the British monarchy, but they were messy. They were messy people. They had a lot of affairs, lots of infighting, lots of drama. Now, another point of contention between father and son was the prince's father refused to provide him with a cash allowance. Now, because of this, Fredrick would do things that were non-traditional. In June of 1737, Fredrick informed his parents that Augusta, his wife, was pregnant and would give birth in October. To prevent illegitimate children, royal births were traditionally witnessed by family members and prominent courtiers. However, Augusta's due date was actually a lot sooner than Fredrick had told his parents. And when she went into labor in July, Prince Fredrick snuck her out of Hampton Court Palace in the middle of the night and forced her to journey 13 miles in a rattling carriage to St. James Palace to prevent the king and queen from attending the delivery. George II was absolutely livid. Fredrick was then expelled from his father's court and established a rival court at his home in Lancaster House, who were mainly Tories. So George II, George I left the control of Parliament to the Whigs. Fredrick would host the opposition party, the Tories, in his London home quite often. Now, the Tories had been totally and completely shut out of politics when George I became king in 1714. The Tories, who are also known as the Court Party, represented the more conservative supporters of Charles II, who endorsed a strong monarchy as a counterbalance to the power of Parliament. They disagreed with the Whigs and the quasi-republican tendencies of Whiggism. They did not want to strip the monarchy from its essential authoritative powers, and they did not want to leave the crown as a puppet entirely dependent on Parliament. Now, the Tories really fell out of favor when they aligned themselves with the Jacobites during the Jacobite Rebellion of 1715. Remember when I said that King George I and George II both had to put down a Jacobite rebellion? Well, it was mainly the Tories that were the head of both of those rebellions. The Tories really wouldn't have any political voice in Parliament until Fredrick. Now, there is a lot of political intrigue to this story and a lot of scheming with the Tories and the Whigs and forming of coalition governments, which is parliamentary politics. But the short gist of it is that with Fredrick, the Tories saw a way to gain political control. Unlike George II, Fredrick was a very affectionate and a very hands-on father, moving with his wife and children to Cliveden, where he fished, shot, and rode with his children. Now, one thing that Fredrick did with his children was that he made it a point to make sure that his children were raised to be English. George III would be the first of the Hanoverian kings to be born and raised in England. English would be his first language, and his father, Fredrick, made sure that the reign of his son could not be mistaken as that of a foreign pretender. Historian Andrew Roberts writes in his book, The Last King of America, quote, George's father, Fredrick, staged a production of Joseph Addison's play, Cato, before a numerous court of the nobility at Leicester House on January 4th, 1749. The cast included Fredrick's 4 oldest children. George would play a Poitiers and delivered a prologue specifically written by his father. It goes, Is the first great lesson I taught, what though a boy, I may with truth be said, a boy in England born, in England bred, where freedom's best becomes the earliest state, for there the love of liberty's innate. Fredrick, possibly sensing that he would die at a young age, wrote to his son, George III, quote, I shall have no regret never to have wore the crown if you do but fill it worthily. Convince this nation that you are not only an Englishman, born and bred, but that you are also this by inclination, and that you will love your younger children next to the oldest born, so you will love all your other countries next to England. Fredrick would die only a few years later after writing that letter to his son George. George was only 13. Before his death, Fredrick would invite the Tories to, quote, unite and coalesce with him. And he actually declared that when he became king, his intentions would be to, quote, abolish all distinction of the Tory party. Now, the Tories would accept Prince Frederick's offer, having been assured that they would have his political favor when he became king. With the death of Fredrick, and soon after the death of several Tory party authorities, the Tories would essentially disappear and become remolded as a Whig faction. Horace Walpole even writes in his memoirs in 1764 of the decline of the Tories, saying, quote, Hitherto I might be said that the two parties of Whig and Tory still subsisted, though Jacobitism, the concealed mother of the latter, was extinct. The subsequent contests were rather a struggle for power than the settled animosity of two parties. Though the body of opposition still called itself Whig, an appellation rather dropped than disclaimed by the court. And though the real Tories still adhered to their own distinctions, while they secretly favored, sometimes opposed the court, and fluctuated accordingly as they esteemed particular chiefs not of their connection or had the more agreeable opportunity of distressing those who supported the cause of freedom, as their whole conduct was comprised in silent votes, and never was considerable enough to turn a single scale in the political changes. I shall seldom mention them anymore. George III would now become the heir apparent, though the relationship with his grandfather, George II, was strained. George II had attempted to bring the heir, George III, closer to him after Frederick's death by establishing him at St. James's Palace, but George and his mother would decline. George's mother, the Dowager Princess of Wales, preferred to keep her son close to her, where she could instill her strict Anglican beliefs on her son. After the death of his father Fredrick, Lord Bute, a very close and personal friend of his father Fredrick, would be appointed the tutor of Prince George. Bute would become like a father figure to the young King George III. Bute was responsible for creating the curriculum that would shape the future king's views on history, law, and politics. Now, Bute's education plan for the future king would prompt a failed attempt in 1752 by Horace Walpole and other Whig leaders to remove him from this position. Members of Parliament feared that Bute was becoming too close to the king. See, Bute flattered himself that, quote, the prospect of serving you, informing your young mind, is exquisitely pleasing to a heart like mine, Bute would write to George III. As historian Andrew Roberts writes, quote, Bute warned the prince that one day someone would whisper to him that he, Bute, had been your father's friend and is strongly attached to the princess. And, he added, I glory in my attachment to the princess, in being called your father's friend, but I glory in being yours too, end quote. Kind of a manipulative way in dealing with rumors that Bute ultimately knew would reach George's ears, were he to establish total dominance over the impressionable teenager. See, Bute was also close to Prince Frederick's widow, Augusta. It was even rumored that the two were having an affair. Walpole's suspicions of Lord Bute were confirmed when George III became king on October 25, 1760, and implemented policies that resulted in almost total restructuring and instability of British politics. Bute was appointed to the Privy Council by George III in just 2 days, and he was made Secretary of State for the Northern Department 5 months later. His quick rise caused consternation in the cabinet, particularly among William Pitt and his minstrel colleagues, who were intent on strongly executing the 7 Years' War against France. The developing rift between the incredibly popular Pitt and Bute reached a breaking point over tactics against Spain and peace terms with the French. The king and Bute wanted a rapid resolution to the conflict rather than a complete one. Pitt, therefore, lost control of the cabinet and would resign his position on October 5th, 1761. On May 26th, 1762, Pitt's successor, the Duke of Newcastle, followed suit in a debate with the king and the isolationist Bute about whether to maintain Prussia's subsidy. The next day, the king took advantage of the situation and named Bute as the First Lord of the Treasury and Prime Minister. Now, I'm sure you are asking at this point, Lisa, what does this have to do with America if all of these issues are between the king and Parliament? And my short answer is everything. What the king had done, whether he was aware of it or not, in backing and appointing Bute as prime minister, was like throwing a grenade that would upend the political landscape of not only England, but her colonies in America. See, by raising Bute to the level of prime minister and allowing Bute to oust the much beloved William Pitt, created the optics both in England and across the Atlantic that George III was nothing but a power-hungry despot. And while at this point in Parliament, every member professed themselves to be a Whig, the distinction in politics would arise between the king's friends, who supported the now activist King George III in government, and those who opposed him. The term Tory would become little more than an unfriendly epithet for politicians who closely identified themselves with George III. The label Tory was in this sense applied to the Prime Minister Lord Bute and later Lord North, even though both prime ministers would call themselves Whigs. That is why during the American Revolution, we often refer to loyalists as Tories or Kingsmen. Bute's 317 days as head of the government would be among the most turbulent in the century, laying the framework of the constitutional issues that resulted in the American War of Independence. And let me tell you, the press let Bute know it as well. He was condemned and excoriated by not just the London press, but the colonial press as nothing but a deceitful crony of the king and a Jacobite-leaning Tory who cared nothing about defending the British Constitution and its hard-won gains in the expensive war. The Treaty of Paris, which would conclude the 7 Years' War, was primarily Bute's creation, and while it was competently negotiated and beneficial to Britain in retrospect, at the time it was criticized by leaders such as Pitt, and swiftly became a huge political disaster for Bute and King George III. With the tremendously popular Pitt now in opposition, the treaty provided fertile ground for political authors like John Wilkes. Now, Wilkes, North Briton number 45, emerged specifically to attack Bute and the king, and its contents contributed to the topic of constitutional corruption, which stroked the political concerns of the extreme Whigs in America and Britain. In an April 1763 speech written by Bute, King George III publicly endorsed his prime minister policies. Wilkes responded with a merciless broadside. His opening paragraph aimed squarely at Bute. Quote, "North Britain has been steadily in his opposition to a single, insolent, incapable, despotic minister, and is equally ready, in the service of his country, to combat the triple-headed Cerberin administration." The king himself fared slightly better, but Wilkes nonetheless lamented that George III had given, quote, "the sanction of his sacred name to the most odious measures," end quote. The terms of the peace treaty drew, quote, "the contemption of mankind on our wretched negotiators," end quote, he declared. He strongly hinted of official corruption when he wrote, quote, "many unnecessary expenses have been incurred only to increase the power of the crown, that is, to create more lucrative jobs for the creatures of the minister." He closed with what the king took as a thinly veiled threat. The prerogative of the crown is to exert the constitutional powers entrusted to it in a way, not of blind favor and partiality, but of wisdom and judgment. This is the spirit of our Constitution. The people, too, have their prerogatives, and I hope the words of Drayton will be engraved on our hearts. Freedom is the English subject's prerogative. George III took this very personally. He ordered the arrest of Wilkes and dozens of his followers on charges of sedition libel. Wilkes argued that as a member of Parliament, he was exempt from libel charges against the monarch. The Lord Chief Justice agreed. Wilkes was released and took his seat again in the House of Commons. He resumed his attack on the government, Bute's successor, George Grenville in particular. See, this became a huge political issue in England, and especially in the American colonies. Colonists and supporters of Wilkes would begin wearing pendants, cufflinks, hats sporting the number 45 in support of Wilkes. By the spring of 1763, Bute was the most despised man on both sides of the Atlantic, and he was harassed, sometimes physically, nearly anywhere he went. His plan to implement a cider tax in England sparked huge riots. and also set off warning bells in the colony of what they perceived as a completely unjust tax. He also proposed taxing Americans to obtain additional income to fund a permanent British armed presence in the colonies, also something that did not go over well in America. Recognizing that his continued tenure would only exacerbate the government's problems, Bute would resign on April 8, 1763, claiming to be withdrawing from politics, though rumors quickly spread that he would remain as George III's senior advisor, maybe more influential outside of government than he was within it, having the king's ear. When the rumors actually proved to be true, the British political system suffered significant harm. Grenville ordered Bute's removal from the king's court, and the circumstances fueled the widespread belief that ministerial actions were the result of an unconstitutional plot involving the throne. Now, Pitt would return to office in 1766, and Bute's relationship with the king would eventually end, though the myth that secret forces were actually undermining the Constitution would taint transatlantic politics throughout the American Revolution. And Bute would remain a symbol of that corruption in satirical prints and political cartoons all the way through the 1780s. Now, King George III, whether he was aware of it, ignorant, insane, mad, whatever you want to call King George III, trust once lost is lost forever. And the first 3 years of King George III's reign, by placing Bute as the head of his government, had placed King George III to be centered as the villain of American liberty and independence. Now, before we wrap up, make sure to hit the like button if you have enjoyed this deep dive into history. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell for more riveting historical content just like this. And share your thoughts below on King George III and his role in shaping American history. Your engagement with this video keeps the history train rolling as we continue down this road to revolution. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye. To George. Sorry, there's a fly in here. Freaking fly. Stupid fly. Fucking fly, man. I gotta get rid of this fly.